Okay, I'm really excited for this one. This should be a pretty good one for Bitcoiners and people who want to live off grid and pursue a more free life and also use free money at the same time. So for this episode, I have CoinsureNZ joining me, and that's his Twitter name. How are you doing?
Not too bad, man. Yourself?
I'm doing really well. I'm looking forward to this. And if you could just give kind of maybe a little bit of a background about yourself so the audience has more familiarity, that would be great.
Sure. So I currently work as a software engineer at Swan Bitcoin. My kind of background in Bitcoin, I got it in 2014. Kind of what attracted me or interested me originally was I was reading about it in the aftermath of the Silk Road trial. Prior to that, for 10 years, I was working as a police officer. So I kind of, based on my experience there, and then reading about the Silk Road trial, I was like, wow, this is amazing that it was going on for this long right in front of their nose, and there was nothing they could do about it. So I was really, really interested in it. And so I, then jumped in and explored, at that time, Silk Road was gone. So it was more like Evolution and Agora and a few other darknet markets. And my interest initially was just how those kind of enterprises could operate. And then, of course, as part of that, obviously Bitcoin was the financial medium they used to make the whole thing work. And so I got interested in looking at Bitcoin then. And like everyone, once you finally get your head around it, you're down the rabbit hole and nothing else matters. So that was like late 2014. So I got in then and have been involved since then. I didn't really do anything involved with the industry for sort of 3 years, but then 2017 happened, and all of a sudden, not only is this the thing I spend all my time reading about, it's also the thing that's maybe the most financially secure of anything in my life. So I started looking about how to get involved otherwise, and went to a bunch of conferences, decided the most easy way was just simply to teach myself, learn how to code. So that was about 3 years ago, and just kind of worked my way up into be able to be a software developer like I am today. I guess kind of what's also of relevance to what we're talking about today is I'm the person that, as I understand it, still has the record for the longest offline Bitcoin transaction at, I'm on the spot at the moment, I think 17.6 kilometers, I think is the distance, which I did with the goTenna system and Samurai Wallet. So basically that involves sending a Bitcoin transaction offline with no internet connection over that sort of distance to be able to send that through. And that was back in 2018, I think I did that. So yeah, that's me.
So cool. Yeah, we're gonna jump into that and talk about how you don't need the internet to send a Bitcoin transaction, which most people are not aware of, and it's really awesome that this is a possibility. It's funny too, yeah. Having a Bitcoin obsession, it's a lot better than like being obsessed with art. Like being obsessed with Bitcoin can often pay off and fund your obsession. Yeah. So, yeah. Okay. So I kind of want to start off with the more high level perspective. I mean, a lot of people who are, a lot of Bitcoiners and just, people who believe in freedom are talking about, pursuing a more free life, getting out of the city, being independent, living off grid. That sort of a lifestyle. And I really do believe that within 5 to 10 years, we're going to see a lot of these places pop up out of the city. And, that's my opinion. That being said, the question of, okay, well, Bitcoin's great. There's only 21 million that can ever exist. It's a lot better than what the Federal Reserve's doing, just printing up tons of money. But what if they shut off the internet? Right? What if the internet goes down? So that's, I think it's a worthy question. I think it's worth exploring. So maybe we could just start off and before we dive into, okay, how would this look like as far as sending, Bitcoin transactions in your Citadel without the internet. But first, I mean, what are your thoughts on what would happen to Bitcoin if the internet just got shut off globally simultaneously?
Yes, I mean, imagine there was a switch you could switch and that could just switch off all the internet. That in itself, I think, is an extremely unlikely scenario. And even if that was to happen, I mean, you could still depend. I don't know. Maybe this is some EMP or some weird thing or other. But even if there was like an off switch where some government Bogdanov conspiracy or something managed to like actually switch off the internet. I mean, you could still have like intranets where you could run wires like LAN cables between computers and still communicate over that. So that's kind of like an important thing to keep as like a bit of an aside of just shutting off the internet is not a clear kind of term, right? We understand what the internet is, but it can be kind of many different things. So that being said, like you just imagine you could switch off the ability for me to communicate with you. I believe we're in the same country at the moment. That, or for me to communicate with someone in another country or overseas or whatever. So in regards to Bitcoin, I mean, you got to understand as part of the Bitcoin protocol, there's several kind of different parts, if you like, and one of them is the peer-to-peer communication protocol, which is how blocks, messages, transactions, and other things get passed between computers, right? So if if the internet was cut off, that is what would be stopped, right? So you could still, the ledger that you had on your computer and all the Bitcoins that you have are fine. That would change nothing. You just wouldn't be able to communicate with other nodes, basically meaning that the blockchain would halt at that particular moment. Now, that's not to say that you couldn't, like, let's say that, it was like how you'd imagine a power failure, right? Like it goes out for 5 minutes and then it comes back on. In that circumstance, it would just mean that the network would halt for 5 minutes as in terms of transactions and the propagation of blocks and other stuff. But you could still be mining while that's going on, and obviously your Bitcoins aren't affected. That you hold, that they're not affected by that situation at all. So it's only really the ability to communicate changes in the ledger that are affected by that. The protocol, by the internet going down. So it's not like an apocalyptic, it's all over scenario. It just means you can't really transact or can't really move anything forward with it. So that would certainly, it would impact its ability to be used as like a medium of exchange, but not necessarily as a store of value, presuming that at some point in the future you could, boot it up and get it rolling again. So it would kind of hold its ability to be used, but not necessarily to store value. So that's kind of the biggest thing that, and there's a lot of other flow-on things about, well, no one could perhaps download a wallet or other bits and pieces that are kind of side issues of not being able to access the internet itself. But as far as the Bitcoin protocol goes, it's actually not like a total disaster scenario. It just kind of like means it's halted. But presuming you could like restart this at some point, it just means nothing is able to be changed until that restart happens. And as I said, you could theoretically be mining this whole time. And as soon as the internet comes back on, you could broadcast this chain of blocks that you've mined for, let's say it was down for a week. You could be mined for a whole week and you could have a number of blocks building each other. You'd all solo mined. You'd run a high chance that, that would not be the longest, the most amount of accumulated proof of work, and it'll be invalid, and you've just wasted all the electricity you've used for. But that could still be done, right? So you could still be kind of transacting you could be transacting, and as long as those were valid blocks, as soon as they got broadcast, everyone else would see that. So yeah, it's not a total disaster scenario, but it more just impacts the ability to communicate and to move the network forward is the biggest impacts, and the internet in general. Which means I think it's another thing that's important to remember is in that scenario, there's a lot of other shit which is going to be, the wall. It's not like that means that Bitcoin is useless. I mean, the banking system is pretty much useless in that situation. A lot of the other infrastructure that we've built on society.
You're breaking up a bit.
In that situation. So, it would kind of stop Bitcoin, but in that sense, it would actually be slightly more resilient than a lot of other stuff.
Yeah. So First of all, can you hear me okay? You were breaking up a little bit there.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. That's a really okay. All right. Yeah. So that's a really good point. I mean, other systems would also go down too. Like if you don't want to use Bitcoin because the internet could be potentially, maybe there's some like kill switch somewhere, and we shouldn't use email then, and we shouldn't use any of the other services that our lives, depend on for the internet. So I don't. For that criticism to be used against Bitcoin, it's like, all right, other things fall into that category as well. And the internet probably wouldn't go off forever too. And I totally agree with you. It's extremely, extremely, extremely unlikely that the internet would be shut off simultaneously all over the world, and not one place would have internet that can run a Bitcoin node or etc. So yeah, and then I think you also brought up a really good point that Bitcoin is probably more robust than other networks because, I mean, unlike the internet, which, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but it appears that the internet has only gotten more and more centralized since its inception, and Bitcoin is the most decentralized network on the planet because you've got tens of thousands of nodes all over the world, all these miners all over the world. So maybe you could just elaborate briefly on how Bitcoin is more robust compared to other systems in this situation.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's kind of exactly as you explained. It's well geographically distributed. It's run by a community of people that have a very paranoid approach to the disaster scenarios, and that are always thinking about something like this and trying to prepare as well as possible. So I mean, that I think that's probably the biggest kind of easiest way to put it is the cultural difference of, the banking system goes down on that scenario, and let's just say it's a 24-hour outage, right? So you have a return to normality straight away, and things come back. But there is a period where stuff can't go on, and people for that 24-hour period are wondering how long this is going to go on, right? Now, the impact of that on traditional financial services, just the normies, if you like, is a lot more severe than Bitcoin, because I think Bitcoin is well prepared for this situation. It doesn't impact their ability to hold their wealth in a sense, whereas I think something like that would shake your faith in the traditional system more than Bitcoin, where you've got like a cryptographic ledger that if the internet goes down, well, it's just not able to be changed. So the banking system, if the internet goes down, I think it just raises a lot more questions about the stability and the foundations of that particular system, because it's just built to be reliant on the internet and society functioning as normal a lot more than Bitcoin is. So in that sense, I think like the disruption that you'd see would be kind of more for the traditional system than it would be for Bitcoin, because of course, as I said before, transactions wouldn't be able to be propagated, but it's able to, the network. I mean, what you're describing there is no different than like for you individually as a user, is if you lost the internet, right? You had a power outage, or your cell signal went out, or you're in an area with no service. That's kind of effectively what you're describing for a Bitcoin user, right? And that's not a biggie. No one freaks out about that. It's annoying that you can't use it, but it's certainly not game over. But that's a lot more disruptive to some of these services that are really, really reliant on that, not just to be a financial services provider, but a lot of the other stuff that goes around it. So the internet going out will be incredibly disruptive to both, but I just think Bitcoiners and the nature of the network itself is a bit more accustomed to not having like a perfectly smooth proviso of services, as opposed to the traditional system where people are kind of expecting this sort of stuff. So I mean, they'd both be pretty seriously impacted, but I just think like Bitcoiners and Bitcoiners are more used to a less than ideal customer experience, let's put it that way, whereas if that was to go on with the traditional system, that causes a lot more disruption because people are really expecting that kind of level of service.
Yeah, no, that's very true. I think we're a healthy level of paranoid. I mean, we're paranoid just to the point where we're gonna make sure we're okay in these sort of situation. And I mean, at this point in the world, I don't know about you, but nothing really surprises me anymore. so I think, yeah,
No.
yeah. So yeah, exactly. So just being prepared is always a good idea. The next kind of topic that I would like to go down the rabbit hole with is, okay, so let's say this Citadel vision does come to fruition, right? Let's say Bitcoiners, we're all ideologically aligned, generally speaking, right? We all kind of believe in freedom. We believe in the principle of I don't mess with you if you don't mess with me. Everybody has a right to be left alone if they're not harming anyone, right? And we band together, and all over parts of the earth, we buy land, and we start building, and we start growing our own food, and we have our own cattle, and we have our own energy, whether it's through solar or hydroelectric power, or any other forms of of power. And we're good. We're living that life. We're creating our new sort of societies, really, which that just excites me so much, because at this point, we like Bitcoiners are basically citizens of a country, but the country is not in any one physical place, if that makes sense, And the next step, in my opinion, is just to set that up like physically in different locations. And just like the Bitcoin network is decentralized, citadels are like almost like decentralized forms of one country, because we all believe in Bitcoin and freedom. Kind of a rant there, but let's say you're on your Citadel. What would your setup look like for a disaster scenario?
Well, I have a slightly different opinion on the Citadels thing, and that is that banding together in one location is, in my opinion, a less than ideal strategic approach to what you're trying to achieve in that situation. I think we've got some pretty good examples of how that pans out, and one of the best ones, the simplest ones, if you want to see it, is there's a Netflix documentary called Wild Wild Country about what I think is probably going to be how a few of these things pan out. So, in my personal opinion, I think a better model for this to be is something like the Freemasons, Jewry or the Jews, something like the Mafia or the Yakuza. Even if you want to get into some pretty extreme examples, something like the Taliban, where you have a group of individuals who have a clear ideological alignment, and kind of almost like a secret society, if you like, where there's a club that you're a member of, and you're able to identify yourselves, but it's not located in one geographic specific location. And that, I think, is just a much more resilient model, in that it is more decentralized, and it's not able to be kind of located or found or grasped, if you like. It's like you're trying to grab water and it just runs between your fingers, right? The state is very well accustomed and has a lot of experience with symmetrical warfare. But when you have something like this, and I'm guessing from your background, you have somewhat of a taste of this, is when you have that asymmetrical warfare where the enemy is, you can't perceive them, from the, a non-combatant and the enemy, they're almost the same. That's a much harder enemy for an apparatus like the state to engage with. And so my ideal Citadel setup based on that would be something more along the lines of, I think resilience is more along, let's have an example of like the favelas in Brazil, or, the colonias in Mexico or whatever. You got there, and a lot of the electricity. In fact, I was reading an article about this in Mexico, where there's something to the tune of, I think, several $1 billion of electricity is illegally appropriated from the network. Where people just hook up like a Jimmy wires setup where they run some wires from the power pole and kind of like steal electricity, right?
Yeah, I've heard of that.
So I think the ideal resilience situation is to be embedded within a society and to operate systems like that, where you kind of like coattail in on other places where it's very hard for them to be able to narrow it down or to find you, particularly if you have, some of those things like the favelas, they are like I'm describing, where perhaps they're in a central location, but they also have like a tight-knit community where, you can kind of go in there, but you still can't find that, if you've ever watched any stuff about policing in those environments, it's like kind of impossible to do because the people just disappear and you can't really kind of find them in any one location. They're a lot less kind of geographically tied to where they are. So I think that would be my ideal Citadel setup, to be honest with you, dude, is like, okay, here's one thing I did in the past was like, I used to have a Dragoman T1 and what I did was I plugged it in at my, when I used to work for an education company, I plugged it in at the office when no one was there. And so it like ran, I had like on the timer switch and stuff. So it ran after everyone left the office and then switched off before everyone came into the office. And so I was kind of mining on someone else's electricity and someone else's internet, you know what I mean? And that would be the sort of scenario I would kind of describe where, you see the same thing with people using like cannabis crops, right? Where they're like, it leaves relatively easy to identify electricity signature. So how people get around that is they just hijack other places' electricity, right? And therefore, if you go to where that signature is coming from, it's at least this won't be the same house. Maybe it's the next house or whatever. There's ways to get around that, right? So that would be my kind of ideal Citadel setup. Is I think having something where you've got like a satellite and some other kind of communication method, but it's in some castle-like compound, right? Well, it's easy to fix that. You just like, surround it with tanks, put some sort of like, radio or other frequency jammers around it, and you've kind of like shut off that situation. But if that's happening in within a community, well, you've got a whole neighborhood that's pissed off because they can't access the internet or whatever it is because you're jamming the stuff, that's going on within it. And if you've done your job properly and you're making sure that just like these other organizations like the mafia, the Yakuza, whatever, where you're taking care of the people in the community as well, right? Where you're not just extorting them for money, but you're also providing services and like a shadow government alternative to the state.
It's kind of what the cartel does in Mexico. Yep.
Exactly, dude. Exactly. So they're not going to, if you're doing your job properly in that regard, they're going to take care of you too, and they're not going to just go and rat you out and throw you out. So that would be my kind of ideal setup. And in saying that, it's hard to like give a straight answer because that would depend very much on the geographical situation you're in, the peculiarities of the culture and the politics in that particular specific area. It can be different suburb to suburb, but I think just that mentality is a smarter one to have as far as instantiating something like this, where rather than it being like a physical setup, it's more about utilizing what's around you and kind of sneaking in under the covers and utilizing something like that, because you don't beat the state by fighting it head on in a force versus force kind of scenario. You beat it by making it impossible for them to be able to target something. So yeah, that would be kind of my ideal Citadel setup.
Yeah, no, that's very interesting. Yeah, it's funny you brought up our former professions. You're an ex-cop, I'm ex-military, so maybe that's largely related to why we're interested in this topic. And
you see the value in it, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we think about this sort of. I think we think about this sort of stuff because we know how nefarious the state can be.
100%.
Yeah, and yeah. So I mean, I can understand that perspective as far as not wanting to have like maybe one centralized citadel, but maybe sort of a spread out community in a more localized area. Something like that. I get that. I think it also depends on where you're at. For example, I've mentioned this many times. The United States, the federal authority in the United States is just massive. I mean, they have so much money, so much guns, all these, they got the alphabet boys, all the 3-letter agencies. And in Mexico, things are a lot different. I've been to, I don't know if I've told you about Chiron. Maybe I mentioned it too much. My viewers have probably heard it like almost every episode, but it's so fascinating to me because it's this place in the state of Michoacan in Mexico, where 10 years ago, the people in this town of 36,000 people kicked out their mayor and the police and the cartel and the National Guard, like all government. And they've been sovereign for 10 years, and now the federal government just doesn't even mess with them. They just recognize that area as a sovereign community. So obviously I don't, I wouldn't want anything that extreme. But I think, Mexico it's a lot more doable to have something like that set up versus the United States, where you have, I'm sure you're familiar with Waco, Texas. You have situations like Waco that happen where those people really weren't harming anybody, and the feds just came in and shot a bunch of women and kids. So, I'd like to move into kind of the more like technical. I mean, if maybe I could paint a Citadel scenario for you, and we could move into a little bit more of the technical conversation. I don't expect you to have all the answers or anything, but just kind of a high level brainstorm sort of idea, if that's okay. And if you have anything else to comment, then feel free.
Go right ahead.
Cool. Yeah. So let's say, all right, here's what I'm thinking. If you had running water, right, you could generate hydroelectric power, and you had a dish to receive. So, for anybody that's not aware, Blockstream, the company Blockstream, has satellites in the air where you can receive Bitcoin data without using the internet. And there are actually a lot of places on Earth that don't even have access to internet. So even under a situation that isn't like an apocalyptic scenario per se, there are still a lot of people without internet who want to participate in the Bitcoin network, and they want to run a node, for example. Then what you can do is you can set a dish up, point it in the direction of the nearest Blockstream satellite, and then receive data from the Bitcoin blockchain and have it updated. So I'm just kind of painting a picture here. And once I'm done, I'd love to hear your thoughts. So that's one thing I would do, right? I would have a dish pointed to the Blockstream satellite. And then I would have goTennas for really every business, let's say, in the area. Every business in the area had goTennas just in case, if our internet went out, we could still locally transact with each other. And those goTennas would have to be, in the end, in a mesh network, they would have to be connected to an internet access point, right? So eventually, all the goTennas in that local community in this mesh network, we're sending information to each other, and then that information gets relayed from goTenna to goTenna, and eventually it hits an internet access point, and then it broadcasts all of those transactions that we made internally offline. It broadcasts those transactions to the Bitcoin blockchain. So that's what I'm thinking. And other than that, maybe solar power as well to power, your goTennas or, your phones or whatever else you need. And I think that would actually be a doable system as long as you have somewhere accessible to your goTennas, somewhere that has an internet access point. It doesn't even have to be near your Citadel though. So, what are your thoughts on that? Do you have any other, do you think this would be a doable setup? Do you have any other ideas as far as how to make it more robust?
Yeah, I definitely do. It would be ideal for a situation like you described there. And I think probably a good hypothetical scenario would be you've created a new kind of settlement or town, right? Where let's say you just get a plot of land and it's in the middle of fucking nowhere, and you show up with even a bunch of tents, and you start, creating some more permanent structures there or whatever. Now, there's no infrastructure there as far as power or internet or anything else, right? So you might have cell signal, or you might have none in there. And if you didn't have the cell signal, well, the issue is going to be, how do we connect to the internet, right? Because you'd probably have to rely on, I don't know, maybe you could pay a private company for this, or rely on waiting for the government to install it, and you might be waiting a long time for that. So how something like a goTenna could work is you could set up a relay in an adjacent town, or even have something as kind of simple as a cell phone with data connection on the top of a nearby hill that was able to get like a couple of bars that was connected to a goTenna, and you'd have to power it and keep your eye on it somehow. But that would be relatively easy to jimmy rig, something like that. And that could be a way where you could get kind of beam internet in, or at least for basic stuff like sending a Bitcoin transaction. That kind of system could work. So it'd be ideal for something like that, where you've created a kind of a settlement to switch it in. But so there's two issues really, right? So as far as the Bitcoin stuff goes, you've got to be able to receive and to send, right? So you've got to be able to receive new blocks. If you broadcast a transaction, you've got to be able to obtain make sure that it's gone through and that it's been transacted. It's been received on the other end and been accepted into a block and everything like that. So you've got to be able to receive the blockchain itself. Though not necessarily that's going to be impossible without it, but really, you're going to need that to be able to make it work, and also to be able to send it out, right? So the receiving you can all do through the Blockstream satellite, which is relatively easy to set up if you're if you're able to get yourself a dish and you've got access to a computer and you're able to power the kind of stuff like this. It's getting the transaction out. Now, as far as getting the transaction out, this is like there's a really good talk by Andreas Antonopoulos, and this is one of the first talks I ever saw when I got into Bitcoin, and this is one of the ones that like really set off the light bulb in my head and kind of changed my whole mind. Was it's called Money as a Content Type, and in that one he talks about a couple of scenarios where, if you wanted to send a Bitcoin transaction itself is like, we think about these things like a credit card, right? If you were to give someone your credit card number, well, they could go use it to steal their money, right? But a Bitcoin transaction, right, there's nothing secure in a Bitcoin transaction. So you could print that on a billboard, you could send it via smoke signal, you could write it on a piece of paper and give it to someone who's going to jump in their car and take it to the next town, and someone is going to scan an OCR, physically copy over those digits, and then broadcast that on the computer. So goTenna is certainly one way, but there's infinite ways that you can smuggle that out and send it out. And it's to kind of return for a second to some of those apocalyptic scenarios that you talked about before. I mean, that, if you're in a really oppressive regime, that could be that blockade. I mean, theoretically, you could memorize a Bitcoin transaction. That'd be kind of hard to do, but you could do it. Or it could be like on a piece of paper tucked inside, some secreted in some orifice in your body. And as long as you get that out and then broadcast it, you can transact on the network. So it would be ideal for a situation like I described, like a settlement sort of one. And I think that's kind of where it's best set up, where, you've got, things are relatively kind of normal. You've got some basic infrastructure as far as the housing, shelter stuff goes, but you just don't have the internet connectivity, and it's a way that you get around it. But there's plenty of other ways that you can use as far as the transacting goes. There's plenty of other ways you can get around this. Same thing with the blockchain itself. I mean, you could do sneakernet it, where someone could download the blockchain, send you a USB, and you wouldn't be up to the minute, but you'd be able to catch up on what had gone on the last week or whatever like that, and you could still transact with the Bitcoin network over a system like that. It would be less than ideal, and there's a couple of little caveats to go with it, but those are all possible.
Very interesting. Okay, so you mentioned, so you were just mentioning that there are different ways that you can do it other than just a goTenna. So that being said, you were talking about a cell tower. You could use the connectivity of the cell tower. Could you elaborate on that a little bit more, and maybe after that we could just go into some of the different ways. I know. Other than that, I mean, you can use a ham radio, and Nick Szabo a few years ago did a presentation on using weak signal radio waves for long distance communications. So I don't know if you've looked into that at all, but maybe you could just elaborate more on, using that. You mentioned beam internet from a cell tower.
I was more meaning that you could let's say you're in a valley and you're, in the middle of nowhere, that you got no cell reception, right? But if you're able to get to the top of a nearby mountain, You might be able to get like 1 bar or something like that on a cell connection. So using a system like that, and this could be 20 kilometers away, you could use goTenna to bridge that physical gap. And then when you got to that connected phone with the 1 bar that's sitting on top of the mountain, that could then broadcast it out to the kind of the greater internet. So I mean, and like, I'm certainly not smart or technical enough to understand how you could do this, but maybe there is some ways to even like jimmy into a cell signal itself. Like on that example, I do know in this country that if you climb up some of the cell towers, there's some other communication apparatus attached to it that apparently some other organizations have just gone ahead and added to the system.
Some other organizations.
Yeah. Well, I believe it's
right.
But I mean, yeah. So I believe there are other ways. Like if you had someone that was an ex cell tower technician or something like that, there may be some other ways like that where you can just like rig into existing infrastructure. But going to the Nick Szabo stuff with the shortwave radio, funnily enough, actually, when I put out that thread about the goTenna thing, he actually BM'd me about it and said like him and Elaine were working on this, and I really wanted to get involved in doing it, but ham radio requires a bit of some specialized equipment and a bit of study. And it's also like, unless you've got a license, it's illegal to do certain things. Like, for example, MVK, I can't remember Lane or MVK. One of them sent the other one. No, actually, this was Shaw's Provost, I think, said it to MVK. They sent a transaction, but because legally you're not allowed to send an encrypted message over ham radio, how they did was actually send a private key. So it's not actually a Bitcoin transaction. They just send a private key. So there's some issues like this about ham radio where technically this is possible to communicate. And it's something I really wanted to try and do with Australia, like someone from New Zealand to Australia. But then there was all the legal issues. And I thought, well, if I'm going to be broadcast to the whole world, I've done this offline Bitcoin transaction, but it's illegal. That might not be the smartest thing
issue.
To be, making a ton of noise about, right? So it is possible, but when I looked into it, it was just quite a lot of work to be able to get my head around the technical side of it. There was legal issues, and I was just super busy at the time with trying to like actually learn how to be an okay software developer. So I never pursued it more than that, but it's definitely a possibility and something that you can look into. So that would work. And look, dude, any method of communication that you can imagine, where you can send a small amount of data over a space and then propagate somewhere else is suitable for the Bitcoin network. Like Bitcoin doesn't need to run on the internet necessarily. It's by far the best communication medium that's most suitable for purpose, but it could theoretically run on some other alternative system. That would just need, there's other technical considerations about why that is,
Well, just to comment on that, I guess, I mean, as far as transactions, it could, but eventually you would still have to have, some form of internet for mining, right? I mean,
not necessarily. I mean, you could mine using shortwave radio theoretically, where you run the miners, you find a block, and then you broadcast it via shortwave radio to another node that gets it, passes it on to another node. The issue with that is I understand the amount of time that would take to propagate around the whole world is longer than 10 minutes, and so therefore you're perpetually behind on the average time it takes to find a Bitcoin block. And so that the kind of system breaks down in that regard. Like it could kind of work, but it would just get horribly out of sync. And I believe, like as far as shortwave radio goes, it just takes that amount of time to bounce around the globe. Whereas the internet's immediate. And if there is some other communication medium that I'm not thinking of right now that could do the similar job about going intercontinental, like crossing seas without using the internet, the same thing could be said. It's just the time of propagation and the latency about blocks that would cause issues, because even if let's say that you can make it work, that the time for it to bounce around there was 5 minutes, you still got some latency issues about two miners, kind of simultaneously or close to simultaneously finding a new block. And the one that propagates the best is the one that's going to, win the Bitcoins. And so that, runs into a whole set of side issues about, if you're using a technology that's not as efficient as the internet, about having to optimize for that block propagation to be able to make sure that you get the return on your investment with your mining. So that's a side thing. But I mean, I think this is an important time to also highlight is, I mean, that same point I made about, and this is again stealing from that Andrea's talk, is, so let's say there's some issues where, they're trying to block the Bitcoin. The internet itself works, but they're trying to block Bitcoin, right? They're blocking port 8333 or some other method, or they're using deep packet inspection to somehow identify what a Bitcoin transactions and block them. You could easily just recode like a Bitcoin transaction or a Bitcoin block as a series of smileys on Skype or on Facebook or whatever, and then you propagate it through that network, right? And if you take that idea and run with it, man, there's some crazy results, because it's just data, and there's a million ways that we have to decode and encode this data. Or you could, you could put it in an image, embed it in the EXIF data, or use some sort of stenography technique to embed it in an image, post it on your Facebook profile, and then someone knows to be checking that every second, and then you get a new photo, they download it, they decode it, they use the same methodology to broadcast it somewhere else. So there's a lot of smart ways you can get around.
I got a comment on that
censorship.
Real quick. Yeah, that is so cool and so sneaky. So you're saying you could take, just to get a little more granular, you could take the, as far as sending the transaction, I mean, you could encrypt it in some sort of like image, or some sort of encrypted message, and then send it to another person so they can receive a transaction. Or I just want to make sure I'm on the same page.
Yeah, I mean, dude, it's just data. So you can obfuscate that data in anything. If the internet is working, and the only way you can communicate that is by sending pictures of great leader Kim Jong-il to other people, you can just embed that in pixels in that data, which to the outside observer, it looks exactly like a picture of the great leader. But if you run it through a particular piece of software that knows what to look for and how to decode it, there's a Bitcoin transaction in there. And so you can just be passing around what look like propaganda images all day, but really you're secretly propagating Bitcoin transactions and blocks.
That is absolutely awesome.
That's not the most efficient, but you could automate that and make that work. If you had the internet, I think you could probably make that work. It would be definitely not ideal, and it would not be anywhere near as efficient system as we know it today. But that could work, right? If you had the internet and it was just out to be posted on some social media site, and then someone knew where to look. And it's easy to create redundancy for that, where you could even use some sort of onion or other randomized technology where it's not even this one person's profile that you're looking all the time. It's some random profile that's selected by an algorithm, but everyone knows who's running the software knows where to go in that moment. And that's it's almost impossible to stop something like that. And if you do, you just create a new algorithm that now they don't know where to look, and you can play that count mouse game for it's a lot easier for you to code some new software than it is for them to be able to shut something like that down. So there's a lot of alternative ways that you can approach this in a scenario like that.
Yeah, the possibilities seem endless. So you would be just in that information that you're concealing and hiding. That would be a PSBT.
Oh, it could be anything, dude. It could be a block, could be a message from one node to another, could be a Bitcoin transaction itself, could be just an encrypted communication, right? It could be anything.
Got it.
You can just embed that data in. There's tons of software on GitHub and even much more user-friendly stuff out there where you can embed this stuff now, and it's freely available in an image or all sorts of other methods of obfuscation. That's the way it works. And again, like I said, even this would not make it an efficient system, but you could even theoretically, I emphasize that, do this all by sneakernet, right? Where, someone creates a block and then they put it on a USB stick and then take it to someone who copies it and takes it to two friends. And then, and this would take forever to go around the world, but it's not impossible. And if you take that idea and it's just a way to look at what the possibilities are, there's plenty of far more efficient technologies than that, which are out there, which are alternatives to the internet as we understand it today, where it's open and there's no real restrictions on how you use it.
Jeez, yeah, that's really amazing. It's the Bitcoin community is only getting stronger, and only more difficult to stop, really. It's pretty amazing. It's pretty amazing that you can send really, I mean, as you're saying, really any information theoretically anywhere through frequencies, through just the ether, through whatever this stuff is in the air, through, that's just mind blowing to me that we have that sort of a technology. We live in the future.
And like I was saying, it's not even that. Like, again, go back to the smoke signals thing. You could just have a dude on a mountain, like in the old days, with a binocular or a looking glass or whatever you used, and someone like making smoke signals, and you can propagate it without any technology whatsoever, just through line of sight. So, it's not even thinking in that level is beyond is more complicated than what is theoretically necessary and possible as far as making the thing resilient to be able to stop the propagation networks. Again, not a very efficient technology that would work in a global sense, but theoretically, that smoke signal could be to the guy in the next town who then has an internet connection, right? And then you're good. And that would work relatively efficiently as far as just sending transactions goes. But it just wouldn't work very well as far as trying to propagate it around the whole world.
Yeah, that's really cool. Yeah, I mean, like I said, the possibilities are endless. Super exciting stuff. So, just kind of wrapping up here, as far as Lightning, I know we talked a little bit briefly about this, but Bitcoin is getting more and more developed. If you were to talk about Lightning with the average person interested in the crypto or Bitcoin space or whatever, a lot of people are saying, Lightning is never coming out and it's taking forever, and Lightning's here. So a lot more developments will come out in the future as well. Maybe you could just talk a little bit about how some of this could be possible with Lightning, if you have anything to say about that.
Yeah, I mean, Lightning makes it slightly more complicated just because of the expire of the HTLC and kind of performing the role of what you'd use a watchtower for, whereby your ability to view or catch someone cheating on the closure of your channel is a bit more difficult in that scenario.
Just quick question. Sorry to interrupt.
Something.
SGLC, could you just define that for anybody who may not know?
HTLC, hash time lock contracts.
Got it.
Hash time lock contracts. So that's the transaction that's the basis of a kind of Lightning channel.
Got it. Thank you.
So I mean the closure of those things, and to make it really basic, so anyone doesn't understand any of this understands. Basically, the Lightning Network has a technology or has a systems in place where if someone was to broadcast a transaction which was a cheat transaction in an older state of the channel, because Lightning channels are just basically you're trading different versions of who has what. So you just kind of like you're updating the ledger, if you like, or the counter about how much is owed on the tab to each person. And any of those things is cryptographically valid, and someone could broadcast that. And how the Lightning network gets around that is if that gets detected, you can broadcast a punishment transaction, which basically lets you take all the Bitcoin in the channel, right? So that's how I avoid someone kind of gaming the system, and that's just kind of a technical snag of the way that Lightning works, right? Which, and all this works perfectly fine with the internet, but that means that if someone does that, there's a certain time where you have a kind of locked time to make that make that punishment transaction. And if you don't detect that, someone could kind of theoretically steal your Bitcoins. And so in a scenario like this where you're not able to efficiently detect that going on, there's some issues about that there. But there's ways you can get around that, and maybe it's using a slightly more trusted system about how you secure this kind of thing. But I mean, things like Lightning, in a sense, not quite, but I mean, they kind of are like an offline Bitcoin transaction, in that you don't need to know what's happening on the blockchain for that Lightning channel to go on, if you know what I mean. It's kind of like its own separate kind of Bitcoin network, if you like, what's happening within that channel and within other channels and things like that there. So look, it's not something I've done a lot of thinking in, and it's, and I hope I'm getting this right, lot 49 protocol that goTenna has done is looking at how some of this can work. It's for in an offline scenario, but I think that's probably how the ideal situation about how this would work. And again, look, I wouldn't pretend to be able to really accurately talk about the specifics here, but it'll be some sort of thing we'd have, that's kind of like a side chain, if you like, which it's a side network running that's based on Bitcoin, but it's running independent of Bitcoin itself. You could have a system like that where, somehow, let's say you had like a CB radio or even like a local mesh network where you've got a bunch of houses that are running a LAN cable between each other. They aren't connected to the internet, but you've got your own intranet. You could have your own kind of like system trading in that, which would work totally efficiently in that thing there. And then at some point, at the end of the week, you'd have final settlement where that would somehow make its way out to the Bitcoin network and get all settled, and then people can get their on-chain kind of Bitcoin in a situation like that. And again, like I might have missed some, I'm just kind of pulling this out of my head as we talk. I might have missed some technical subtleties there, but there are kind of alternative scenarios like that where you could take a Bitcoin transaction as being the basis of this thing. So I've sent you on Bitcoin. Now we can kind of open a tab just on paper about, I now take some goods and services, which subtract some of that one Bitcoin balance that I've sent to you. And then later we work out what we owe each other, and then we kind of figure that out through a Bitcoin transaction that settles who should have what at the end, right? Which is kind of in a really, really rough way how Lightning works. So you could create some alternative system where that could just almost be an Excel spreadsheet, right? And you could figure out a way to settle that with a Bitcoin transaction at the end. If you had like a community where everyone trusted each other, there's a high level of trust, and everyone was happy with the way that works, you could implement a system, something like that there. Again, there's probably some technical hitches in that I'm just making up as I go, but I mean, there are systems like this which don't require immediate access to the Bitcoin network if you have a higher level of trust. You don't need to be relying on what the blockchain does to be able to have a system of exchange.
That's so fascinating. Yeah, so you could have, like you just said, a community of people. They're all using Lightning, and they get their day-to-day transactions, and at some point in time, maybe every week or something like that, you have final settlement of those transactions, and they all get broadcasted to the actual blockchain.
Yeah, right? In theory.
Yes.
There might be missing something there. But I mean, the idea of what you're talking about there certainly is possible. It's just there might be some technical implementation issues about some what if scenarios that you need to think about that there. But the general idea is totally possible. So yeah,
I think these conversations are really important because having that healthy level of paranoia where you want to have a system that's extremely robust, and what Bitcoin is going up against is like the most powerful system on earth, which is the central banking system. It's the most powerful because they can just create wealth out of thin air and pay for anything they want with it, which is just absolutely immoral and ridiculous and archaic at this point. So I think like the more these conversations happen, the more we entertain these ideas, I think eventually the market will provide. And I picture a demand for something like this growing because, I mean, I'm bullish on citadels, and with the citadels comes, the desire to have a robust network and, just in case something goes wrong. And I think the market will provide for that. So I think it's really only a matter of time, just like anything, just like I mentioned earlier, Lightning, people were saying, it's never happening. Lightning's taking forever. And then now we have Lightning. Other things are going to happen too. And we're so new with this technology. The white paper was only released in 2008 and it's 2021. So we have a lot of time to figure this stuff out. And I'm just so excited to see where this goes. And the more I've personally looked into the idea of, okay, what if the internet was shut off, or what if there was an apocalypse? How would Bitcoin deal with that? The more confident I get. And right now, I mean, yeah, the reality is that, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but the reality is that if there was some sort of crazy blackout event and all of the internet was shut off, yeah, Bitcoin would not be functional right now. But there are many ways we can get around it, and the reality is that it's probably never going to happen that simultaneously worldwide all the internet is shut off. More realistically, what's going to happen and what we've seen is authoritarian governments can shut off internet for their citizens in a certain local area, or maybe a certain person is being censored and their ISP shuts off their services, stuff like that. It's probably realistically, it's probably just going to be a lot more localized, and the advantage is that somewhere else on planet Earth, there is internet, and the Bitcoin blockchain can still run off of that internet. So,
kind of static technical entity, if you like. But hopefully, as I've just explained, you have the protocol, but you're only limited by imagination about some of the ways you can elaborate on how things are done currently and how you can use that to get around censorship or other kind of issues and things like that there. And really, the sky is the limit more than you might think. I mean, Bitcoin has to run by the rules of Bitcoin. Outside of those confines, there's a lot of ways that we can get around this. And the most important way, I think, is things like, and again, not to say I'm correct here, but perhaps the different way I view the kind of the Citadel thing. There's different ways to approach this. You've got to be creative about what is the right one for the scenario and the situation you're facing. And so with all of these technologies and all these ideas, just remember your imagination is a very important tool, and don't be afraid to put it into place.
Excellent point. Totally agree with that. I can't tell you how much I appreciate you, coming on the podcast and talking about this with me. I thank you so much. It was a really good time exploring this with you, and really appreciate it. So give them a follow, folks, on Twitter, CoinsureNZ, CoinsureNZ, as in New Zealand. So thanks so much.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
All right. Well. Cheers.